"I'm not here to judge," Brian Carter muttered under his breath as he looked around the upscale restaurant, but the truth was, he was always judging. It was his job, after all, to make swift, calculated decisions. Whether it was business or the people around him, he'd mastered the art of reading people in a second. But as he glanced at the quiet waitress, Lily Green, something about her intrigued him. She wasn't like the others. Most of the staff here knew their place, speaking only when spoken to, smiling when they were supposed to. But Lily? She had a calm that was almost unnerving, as if she didn't need to impress anyone, and yet she still did. Brian leaned back in his chair, watching her move from table to table with grace, a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the busy, high-powered world he inhabited. He couldn't quite place it. She was just another waitress, wasn't she? Then, as the evening went on, Brian overheard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Lily didn't know he was listening, but he had a sharp ear. She was talking to a customer, a man who had been giving her a hard time all evening, and the way she spoke to him was flawless. She wasn't just making small talk. She was holding her ground, her words precise and intentional. Brian's curiosity piqued, but he didn't say anything. He let the moment pass, pretending to focus on his meal. But the more he watched her, the more questions flooded his mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she here, serving overpriced wine and pasta at a restaurant like this, when she could be doing something more? He heard more over the course of the night. Comments from other diners, jokes at her expense, remarks about her quiet little world that she must live in. It was nothing new. Waitresses were often the subject of such idle chatter, but Lily, she didn't seem bothered by it. Not even a flicker of irritation crossed her face. And that was the first thing that struck Brian. She was different. But what was it that made her so different? As the night continued, Brian found himself leaning in, almost imperceptibly, listening to every word exchanged between Lily and the customers. She knew more than she let on. She was holding something back, something Brian couldn't yet understand. But he wasn't about to ask. No, he'd wait. He always waited, watching for the right moment to make his move. And then it happened. Lily was talking to another table when a passing comment caught his attention. "Did you know she used to be a linguistics major?" one of the other servers said, as if it was nothing. But for Brian, it felt like a key had just turned in his mind. Linguistics? The quiet waitress who had been serving him all night was studying something as sophisticated as that? It didn't add up. Brian stayed quiet, not letting on that he'd heard. He was always good at keeping his thoughts hidden. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. There was more to Lily Green than met the eye. The next evening, Brian returned to the same restaurant. He didn't have any business meetings here, no important deals to finalize. He just couldn't stop thinking about Lily. There was something magnetic about her, something that he couldn't quite understand. As soon as he stepped into the restaurant, he spotted her immediately. She was moving between tables with the same quiet confidence he had noticed the night before. But tonight, there was something different. Tonight, she was wearing a slight smile as she served a couple at the corner table, her eyes bright with a warmth that he hadn't seen before. He had never paid much attention to the staff before. To him, they were just part of the background, necessary but invisible. But Lily was different. She wasn't just another face. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like there was something waiting to be uncovered. As the night went on, Brian found himself observing her more intently. He had come to watch her, but something about her demeanor made him feel like he was the one being observed. At one point, she caught his eye across the room, and for a split second, their gaze locked. She didn't look away. Instead, she held his stare for a moment longer than expected. It was subtle, but it was enough to make his heart race. A simple look, and yet it felt like an invitation to ask more, to know more. But Brian didn't act on it. He never did. He kept his distance, silently watching her move through the room. As she passed his table, she smiled politely, but she didn't speak. And that was the thing. She had this way of being present, without saying a word. Brian wasn't sure if it was intentional, but it was powerful. It made him feel like he was the one who needed to prove something, not her. As the evening progressed, Brian's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices nearby. A group of businessmen at the table next to him were talking, their conversation drifting in and out of his awareness. At first, he barely noticed them, but then one of them spoke up, clearly unaware that he was speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I hear she used to be a linguistics major," one man said, his voice thick with disbelief. Brian's ears perked up immediately. "Linguistics? The waitress?" "Yeah, apparently. But she dropped out to work here," the man replied. Brian sat up straighter.
He had been right.
There was more to Lily than he had assumed. She wasn't just a waitress at all. She was someone with a past, someone with intelligence and a story she wasn't sharing. Brian's mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. Why would someone like Lily, someone with a background in linguistics, choose to work as a waitress? What had happened to her to make her take such a drastic turn? Brian didn't know, but he was determined to find out. As the night came to a close and the restaurant began to empty out, Brian caught a final glimpse of Lily. She was standing by the door, chatting with one of the other staff members, her smile genuine, her laugh light. For a moment, she looked completely at ease, and for the first time, Brian wondered if he was the only one who was out of place. He had made millions of dollars, built an empire from nothing, but there was something about Lily that made him feel small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him question everything he thought he knew about people. He watched her for a few more seconds, then stood up. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to talk to her. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find out more. As he walked toward the exit, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Lily. He was about to leave when he heard a voice from behind him. "Are you leaving, Mr. Carter?" It was her voice. Brian turned around slowly, surprised that she had addressed him directly. Lily was standing a few feet away, her eyes soft, but there was an unmistakable confidence in her posture. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk for a moment," Brian said, his voice quieter than he intended. She tilted her head slightly, as though considering his request. "Of course," she replied, her smile still intact, but now with a hint of curiosity. Brian's heart raced again, but this time, it wasn't from confusion. It was because for the first time in years, he felt like he was about to uncover something that might change his life. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew he wasn't going to leave this place without finding out more about Lily Green. Brian watched as Lily took a step toward him, her confident stride never wavering as she closed the distance between them. Her eyes were steady, yet there was something different about her expression now, a slight shift, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Brian stood still, unsure of what he was about to say. For the first time, he felt a bit out of his element. "So, Mr. Carter," Lily said, her voice calm, almost too calm, considering the situation. "What is it that you want to talk about?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a certain sharpness to it, as if she already knew what was coming. Brian paused, gathering his thoughts. "I heard something tonight," he continued, his voice lower than he intended. "Something about you, about your background."
"I'm curious."
"Why are you working here?" Lily didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stood there for a moment, studying him. Brian couldn't help but notice how her posture had shifted slightly, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. "I suppose I could ask you the same thing," she said after a beat, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "What makes you so curious about me?" Brian wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially by someone in her position. Normally, he was the one asking the questions, the one holding the power in any conversation. But tonight it felt different. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice betraying the vulnerability he rarely showed. "I just feel like there's more to you than what meets the eye. You're not just a waitress, are you?" Lily's gaze softened slightly, but there was no hesitation in her response. "No, I'm not," she said quietly. "I was a linguistics major before I dropped out. Life had other plans." Brian's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He had heard the rumor, of course, but hearing it directly from her mouth made it all the more real. "Linguistics?" he repeated, trying to wrap his head around the idea. That's impressive. Why would you leave that behind?" Lily's smile faded, and for a brief moment, she seemed lost in thought. "It wasn't a choice," she said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were talking to herself. I had to drop out. Family issues. My mom was sick, and I couldn't afford both tuition and medical bills. So, I came here. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Brian felt a pang of empathy. It wasn't something he had expected from her, this raw honesty. He had assumed she was just like every other waitress, just doing the job to make ends meet. But now, he saw her in a completely different light. I didn't know, he said softly. I had no idea. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Lily shrugged slightly, as if brushing off his sympathy. It's fine. I'm here now. And I'm not complaining. I made my choices. Brian watched her for a moment, his mind racing. He had been so focused on the business deals, the power plays, the calculations that went into every decision. But Lily's story, her words, made him pause. Maybe there was more to life than just success and wealth. Maybe there was a different kind of strength, one that didn't come from power, but from perseverance. I admire your strength, he said, his voice sincere. You've been through a lot, and yet you still stand here, doing your job with grace. Lily met his gaze and, for the first time that evening, there was a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. It's not about grace, she said. It's about survival. The words hung in the air between them, and Brian found himself nodding slowly, as if he finally understood something he hadn't before. They stood there, in silence for a moment, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. Brian wanted to say more, ask more questions, but he realized that he had already crossed a line. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. And as he stood there, facing Lily, Brian knew that this was only the beginning. There was much more to discover, much more to learn about her. But for the first time, he wasn't in control. He wasn't the one asking the questions. And that in itself felt like a revelation. As Brian stood there, absorbing Lily's words, he realized something he had never considered before. Here he was, a man who had built his entire life around control and precision, yet the one person who had shaken his perspective was a waitress with a hidden past. The truth of it all hit him like a wave. This wasn't just about business, about making deals and expanding his empire. There were real lives behind every story, every decision, every person he crossed paths with. He had been so focused on power that he had forgotten about the human connection, the kind of connection that Lily had, the kind of strength that didn't need to be flaunted but quietly endured. The silence between them felt heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes from mutual understanding, even if unspoken. Lily shifted slightly, breaking the momentary stillness. I know you didn't come here just to talk about my past, she said, her tone steady but not unkind. Brian blinked, a bit startled by her perceptiveness. It was true he hadn't. He had come to talk about something else, something that had been on his mind since last night. But now, standing before her, everything felt different. No, he admitted, I didn't. He paused, trying to find the right words. I want to offer you something. Lily raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. Something, she repeated, her voice curious. Brian exhaled slowly, considering his next move. He had never offered anyone something without expecting something in return. But tonight, something had shifted. I want to offer you a position at my company, he said, his voice firm, but laced with sincerity. A real one. Not as a waitress. Not as someone working to get by. But as someone with talent. Someone who deserves more than just this. Lily's expression didn't change immediately. She didn't rush to answer, which, to Brian's surprise, made her seem even more powerful. He could see her weighing the offer in her mind. She wasn't someone who would make a decision hastily. Why me? She asked finally, her voice low, but piercing. Why offer me something like this? Brian leaned in slightly, his voice softening. Because I see something in you. I see more than just a waitress. I see someone who has the potential to do something incredible, someone who doesn't even realize her own worth yet. Lily seemed to consider this for a moment, her eyes not leaving his face. She was silent, but Brian could feel the wheels turning in her mind. The air between them thickened with anticipation. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice steady, but with a hint of disbelief. "And what exactly would I be doing at your company?" she asked. Brian smiled, the weight of his words sinking in. "I want you to help me with strategy," he said. "I want you to help me think outside the box, see things that others don't. You have a talent for it. I can see it in the way you spoke to that customer last night, the way you handled the situation. That kind of thinking isn't something you just pick up overnight. You have a gift for it." Lily remained still, processing his words. She had expected the conversation to go in 100 different directions, but this wasn't one of them. It wasn't about her being a waitress anymore. It was about what she could bring to the table, what she could offer that was bigger than any role she had ever been given. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slightly. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. Brian felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it wasn't the relief of a deal sealed. It was the relief of knowing that he had stepped into new territory, somewhere he hadn't been before. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but in that moment, he knew he had done something important. He had recognized something in her that no one else had. He had seen her for who she really was. And as he watched her turn to walk away, he felt something stirring within him, a sense of possibility, a sense of something more than just business. Maybe this was the kind of change he needed too. The next few days passed in a blur for Brian. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Lily. Her face lingered in his mind, calm, composed, yet there was something in her eyes that told him she had so much more to give than she let on. It was as if she had a world of untapped potential hidden behind that waitress uniform. He had offered her something, a chance to change her life, and yet, he found himself wondering if she would even take it. Was she truly ready to step into something so much bigger than the life she had created for herself? He hadn't expected her to answer immediately.
He knew better than that.
People didn't make big decisions on the spot, especially not someone like Lily, who had been through so much. But every time he thought about the offer, his mind raced. He had seen something in her. That quiet intelligence, that unspoken confidence, it was rare, and it was exactly what his company needed. But he also knew that whatever decision she made would not be just about the job. It would be about her trusting herself, about her understanding that she could do more than just survive. One afternoon, as Brian walked into the restaurant for a quick lunch meeting, he found himself scanning the room for Lily. It was an impulse, one that he couldn't quite explain, but he was relieved when he spotted her behind the counter. She was busy, as usual, moving with purpose and ease, taking orders, checking on customers. There was something about the way she moved that still captivated him, effortless, yet purposeful. As he sat down at a table near the window, his eyes followed her movements, waiting for her to notice him. He didn't want to interrupt her, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the urge to see her again, to understand her better. Moments later, she approached his table, the same polite smile on her face, but there was something different this time. She didn't just drop off the menu and walk away. No, she lingered for a moment, her eyes meeting his in a way that made Brian feel as if she were silently asking, "What now?" "I was wondering if you'd had a chance to think about my offer," Brian asked, his voice casual but laced with anticipation. Lily hesitated, just for a moment, and then nodded. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in her tone. Brian leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he had been expecting, but the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, made him feel like this was the moment that would change everything. "And," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a deep breath, her expression calm but serious. "I'm ready," she said simply. "I'll take the position." Brian felt a rush of relief flood through him, followed by a wave of excitement he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about a job offer. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that neither of them had anticipated when they first met. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice steady. "You won't regret it." Lily gave him a small smile, one that was both sincere and a little cautious.
"I hope not," she replied.
And with that, Brian knew that the next chapter of both their lives was about to begin. As he watched her walk away, His mind raced with the possibilities. There was so much more to discover about Lily, and he was more than ready to uncover it all. This was no longer just about business. It was about something more. Something real. The following week, Brian sat at his desk, reviewing the reports that had piled up during the past few days. He hadn't expected to feel the weight of the decision he had made. Offering Lily the position had seemed like the right thing to do, but now, as he stared at the numbers in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right call. He knew she had the potential, but was she truly ready for the kind of work his company required? Brian couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about bringing someone new into the fold. This was about something bigger, a shift in how he saw the world, and how he would run his business from now on. He had always prided himself on being able to predict outcomes, to plan for every possible scenario. But Lily had shown him that there were things you couldn't predict. Things that defied logic and strategy. She had a depth to her that he hadn't expected, a quiet power that wasn't immediately obvious, but was unmistakable once you saw it. Just as he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lily. "I'm ready for tomorrow," it said. "Looking forward to our meeting." A smile tugged at the corner of Brian's mouth. He had been nervous about her decision, but now, reading her message, he felt a sense of certainty. She was ready. This was happening. The next day, Lily walked into Brian's office for their first official meeting. She was dressed in a simple but professional outfit, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked confident, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. Brian stood up from behind his desk and extended his hand to her. "Welcome aboard, Lily," he said, his voice warm. Lily shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Carter," she replied. "I won't let you down." Brian gestured for her to sit, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. As they both sat down, Brian couldn't help but notice how comfortable she seemed in the space, as if she had belonged here all along. She had that ability to fit in, to blend into any environment, without losing herself. "I'm glad to hear that," Brian said, his tone genuine. "Now, let's talk about what you'll be working on." Lily nodded, her expression focused. "I've been reviewing the company's current strategy, and I believe there are some areas where we can improve. I think we should focus more on diversification and less on high-risk investments. We're heavily invested in a few key industries, but if those industries take a hit, it could cause us to lose a lot." Brian leaned forward, intrigued by her assessment. She was speaking his language, but with a fresh perspective, one that he hadn't considered. "That's an interesting take," he said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll need you to elaborate on that. What industries do you think we should be looking at?" Lily smiled slightly, clearly enjoying the challenge. "I think we should focus on emerging markets, particularly in sustainable energy. The market is still growing, and while it's competitive, the long-term rewards outweigh the short-term risks." Brian's eyes lit up with interest. This was exactly the kind of thinking his company needed. Bold, forward-thinking, and not afraid to take calculated risks. "I like where your head's at," he said, nodding. "Let's put a plan together and present it to the board." The meeting went on for another hour, with Lily outlining her ideas and Brian listening intently, offering suggestions and asking questions. By the time they were done, Brian was more excited than he had been in weeks. Lily had just proven that she was exactly what his company needed: a sharp mind, a fresh perspective, and the drive to make things happen. As they wrapped up, Brian stood and walked toward the door, opening it for her. "I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes," he said, his voice full of anticipation. "Welcome to the team, Lily." As she walked out of his office, Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. She had just stepped into a world that was completely new to her, but somehow, it felt like she had been destined for this all along. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone with a future, someone who had the power to make a difference. And as she walked down the hallway toward her new office, she couldn't help but smile to herself. She was ready for whatever came next. Over the next few weeks, Lily settled into her new role at the company. She quickly became an integral part of the team, her ideas resonating with everyone from junior analysts to the executives, including Brian. It was clear that her fresh perspective was making an impact, and the company's strategy began to shift. Brian watched with a sense of pride as Lily took charge of various projects, her confidence growing with each passing day. He had never expected to find someone like her, someone who not only had the intelligence and skill but also the humility to keep pushing forward despite her past. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the potential she had unlocked in herself. Lily's presence in the office had become a quiet force. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but her work spoke for itself. She had this way of speaking in meetings, calmly but with authority, that made everyone stop and listen. Her proposals were always well thought out, grounded in research, and her ability to communicate complex ideas clearly was unmatched. Brian had seen many talented people over the years, but none who had the same kind of natural leadership that Lily seemed to possess. One afternoon, Brian sat across from her in a meeting room, reviewing some financial reports. The day had been long, but there was something about the way Lily worked that made him feel energized. She was methodical, yet flexible, adapting to new information without losing sight of the big picture. As they finished up, Brian couldn't help but comment on how impressed he was. "You've really outdone yourself," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've seen a lot of proposals, but yours, they're different. You think about things that no one else does." Lily smiled, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "Thank you," she replied, her voice modest. "I've learned a lot from working with the team. I think we all bring something unique to the table." Brian chuckled. "That's one way of putting it. But I think it's safe to say you've brought something truly unique. Your ideas are exactly what this company needs." There was a pause between them, and Lily shifted slightly in her seat. "I'm just trying to do my part," she said softly, but Brian could tell there was more to it. It wasn't just about doing her part. This was her moment. She had taken an opportunity, a chance that had been offered to her, and she was making the most of it. Brian couldn't help but feel proud of her. He had offered her this position, yes, but she had earned every bit of success that had come her way. As the days turned into weeks, Brian found himself increasingly drawn to her, not just for her intellect, but for her resilience. She had this quiet strength, a determination that wasn't flashy, but steady. It was the kind of strength that made people want to follow her, to trust her. And it was that same strength that Brian admired. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with the board, Brian found himself at the restaurant again. He wasn't meeting anyone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see Lily. When he walked in, she was there, behind a counter, just as calm and composed as always. She was talking to a customer, smiling in that easy way of hers, and Brian couldn't help but watch her. There was something about the way she carried herself, so unassuming, yet so strong, that made him pause. He had seen many people in his life, many people who wore their success like a badge, but Lily wasn't like that. She didn't need to flaunt anything. She just was. As he walked toward her, she looked up and smiled, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Mr. Carter," she greeted him warmly. "What brings you here tonight?" Brian smiled, feeling a rare sense of ease. "Just thought I'd grab a bite," he said casually. He paused, unsure of what he really wanted to say. It wasn't just about the food, it was about something else. "I've been thinking about how much things have changed," he continued, his voice soft. "You've really made a difference here, Lily." She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It's all part of the job," she replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. Brian chuckled lightly. "I think it's more than that." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other. It wasn't the same as their first conversation. There was no hesitation now, no uncertainty. This was different. This was real. And for the first time in a long while, Brian realized that the most important thing wasn't the business. It wasn't the deals or the numbers. It was people. It was the connections that made everything worth it. And as he looked at Lily, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had made the right choice in offering her that position. Not just for the company's sake, but for her own sake, too. And for his. The door to the future was wide open, and Brian knew that together. They were about to walk through it. Weeks passed, and Brian continued to watch Lily's transformation. She was no longer just the quiet waitress he had met so many months ago. She had become a key player in the company, her ideas shaping the company's direction and challenging the very way things had been done before. Brian had always believed that success was about numbers and strategies, but Lily had shown him that sometimes the right person with the right perspective could change everything. As the months went on, their relationship grew beyond just work. There was a respect between them, a mutual understanding that went deeper than any business transaction. Brian found himself confiding in Lily, something he had never done with anyone else in the company. He trusted her opinion, valued her insight, and most importantly, he admired her strength. But as much as they had grown close, there was always a subtle distance between them. Brian had always kept a part of himself hidden, even from the people closest to him. Lily, for her part, was content to keep things professional. She had never allowed herself to get too close to anyone in the company, knowing that her position was always precarious. She had worked too hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let anything or anyone derail her progress. Still, Brian couldn't help but notice the small moments, the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking, the quiet conversations that lasted just a little longer than necessary. He knew that there was more between them, but he wasn't sure if it was something either of them was ready to acknowledge. One afternoon, Brian found himself at his desk, reviewing the final draft of a new company proposal when Lily knocked and stepped into his office. There was a new energy about her today, a sense of excitement that Brian hadn't seen before. She smiled brightly as she approached, her eyes sparkling with the confidence she had gained over the past few months. "I think I've got something for you," she said, holding a folder in her hand. "I've been working on a new initiative, something I think could really take us to the next level." Brian looked up, intrigued. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steady. Lily placed the folder on his desk and sat across from him. As she began explaining the new project, her words flowed with the same clarity and conviction he had come to expect from her. She was outlining a strategy to enter a new market, one that was risky but held enormous potential. Her analysis was spot on, her approach bold, and her enthusiasm contagious. As she spoke, Brian couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for her. He had known from the start that Lily was special. But this was the kind of thinking that could revolutionize the entire company. "Lily," Brian said, his voice filled with a new sense of respect, "this is exactly what we need. It's bold, it's risky, and it's exactly the kind of direction we should be heading in." Lily's eyes lit up, a smile tugging at her lips. "I'm glad you think so. I've put a lot of work into it, and I really believe it could make a difference." Brian nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We're going to move forward with this," he said, his tone resolute. "I'll have the team start working on the details." Lily's expression softened as she met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with something unspoken. Brian's heart raced in his chest, and he realized for the first time that there was something more here, something more than just respect, more than just admiration. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had worked with many talented people, but none had affected him like this. None had made him feel like this. The silence stretched on, and Brian opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, Lily stood up, breaking the moment. "I'll leave you to it," she said with a smile, her voice as composed as always. "Let me know if you need anything else." Brian watched her walk out of the office, his mind still spinning from the emotions he hadn't expected to feel. For a long time, he sat in his chair, staring at the door she had just walked through, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. He had known from the beginning that Lily was different, but now, more than ever, he realized just how much she had already changed his life. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Brian found himself working closely with Lily on the new initiative she had proposed. Her ideas were taking shape, turning into something more tangible with every meeting. The team was energized, pushing boundaries, thinking in ways they hadn't before. Brian couldn't help but admire Lily's relentless focus. She had an uncanny ability to lead with ease, and every decision she made seemed to be the right one. It wasn't just her intellect that impressed him, it was her ability to inspire those around her. But as they spent more time together, Brian began to notice something else. There was a connection between them, something deeper than just professional respect. It was subtle, but it was there in the way they worked together, the way their ideas flowed seamlessly between them. Brian had always prided himself on being in control, but with Lily, he felt a shift. For the first time in a long while, he found himself feeling uncertain, not in the decisions they were making, but in the growing feelings he had for her. He couldn't deny the pull between them, the quiet moments they shared when no one else was around. The way she looked at him sometimes, with a softness that made his heart race. But he wasn't sure how to approach it. She was his employee, and he couldn't risk complicating things. Yet every time they spoke, every time they collaborated, the line between professional and personal seemed to blur. One evening, after a long day of work, Brian found himself walking into the restaurant again. He hadn't planned on it, but something inside him urged him to go. When he entered, he immediately spotted Lily. She was sitting at the bar, her back to him, but her posture was relaxed, her usual composure radiating even in her downtime. Brian hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. As he approached, Lily turned, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone warm, though there was a hint of surprise in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." Brian smiled, a little embarrassed by his sudden appearance. "I guess I just needed to get out of the office for a bit," he said. "Mind if I join you?" Lily nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. "Of course." As he sat down, Brian realized how much he enjoyed these small, unexpected moments with her. They were no longer just colleagues. There was something more between them, something that had been slowly building, and it was impossible to ignore. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Brian spoke. "You've been doing amazing work, Lily," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "The project is moving forward because of you. I think we're on the brink of something big." Lily smiled, though there was a trace of something else in her eyes, something that told Brian she understood what he
Was really saying.
"Thank you," she replied softly. "I couldn't have done it without the team. We're all in this together." Brian nodded, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Brian wanted to tell her everything, that he admired her, that he was beginning to feel something more than just professional respect, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply sat there, in the quiet of the moment, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. Lily broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said, her smile warm. "You know, when I first started here, I didn't think I'd be part of something this big." Brian looked at her, his heart swelling with admiration. "You're more than just part of it," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You're leading it." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The world outside the restaurant seemed distant, as if nothing existed beyond the two of them. Brian knew, in that moment, that something had changed. Something had shifted between them, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to confront it. But for now, he was content. They were here, together, and that was enough.